During the race, the commentator passionately comments on everything that happens. He emphasizes that the protagonist, Leo Lombardi, is very easy on the eye, because he is a prince of the racetracks who flew into the list of leaders and is as fast as lightning. According to him, the fighting spirit of the young champion is truly frightening, because the finish line is not far away. A Lombardi from the team called Zeus is rapidly surging ahead. All the people who watch the race is very happy about this outcome. And then, only a few moments later, the protagonist was already in first place. Thus, the race in Miami ended unexpectedly, at which point the protagonist, as I expected again, became the winner and remained the incomparable champion of the race. The reporter who wanted to film the winner of the race was surprised because he didn't understand where the protagonist had vanished so quickly. But it turns out that at this time, Leon is in the pantry where his face fully reveals how strong a sense of pleasure he is getting at the moment. It turns out that he is not alone there, but together with his friend who is also a racer. They have a good time together and the champion is incomparably happy, as if he once again won the race. At this point, the protagonist's friend tells him that they have to go back soon. But Leo didn't even want to hear those words, so his friend Zamel covered his mouth with the palm of his hand. At one point, JJ tries a new trick that makes the protagonist marvel at it. He even claims that his friend is playing against the rules and says that if he keeps doing it, he won't be able to think of anything else but him. But suddenly, the protagonist asks his friend to stop, because paying attention to the phone, he noticed that Frank is calling him. He was very angry and began to shout at the protagonist. He immediately asked where Leo was, because according to him, the award ceremony will soon begin, and the champion has not heard a word from the champion. At this point, the protagonist quickly put on his racing uniform and emphasized that he didn't know about it at all. He asks Frank to start yelling at JJ because he didn't even warn him about it. But then Frank said that the guy is just a mechanic and not Leo's manager, and so he doesn't have to tell him about it. At this point, the protagonist realized his mistake and immediately said that he would go to the podium right away. But before he left, he turned to his friend and emphasized that as always he had forgotten to thank him for such an interesting pastime. At this point, two reporters admire how good the protagonist is at what he does. According to them, Leo was again able to take the first place, so won the bonus for the fastest lap. According to them, it's just incredible, because the guy, since last year on the wave of success, it turns out at the moment he is leading with a total score of 139 points. Reporters also report that if the trend continues, the main character could become world champion for the second year in a row. At this point, he is celebrating his victory. They can also apparently watch the birth of a new world racing star, and no doubt a favorite among motorsports fans. At this point, the mechanic joined the celebration, but Frank said that the guy came too late. The celebration is already ending. Then Frank tells him that he's more than sure that JJ more than anyone else didn't want to miss this moment. It turns out the reporter is also wondering whether Leo, who won the World Cup Series winner's trophy, will be able to keep his lead without letting anyone overtake him. They wonder who will be favored by Lady Luck in this case. Sometime later, the mechanic was chatting with someone on the phone and said he had arrived at his destination, at which point the door to his van opens. There is some young guy carrying the main character who resists and doesn't want to go home. He says that he is sober as a glass, and so he asks that he and his friends have at least one more drink. But his friend, who realizes that Leo is in a drunken state, asks JJ to pick up this drunkard and take him home. At that moment, a group of girls distracted the protagonist and began to congratulate him with another victory in the race. Because of them, the protagonist once again asked his friend to drink a little more with them, because they are really cute. But his friend refused and said that it would be better if the protagonist went home and went to bed, because that way he can get drunk to death. Then his friend also approached the mechanic, saying that it was all his job, by the way. According to him, JJ lets the protagonist rely on himself for everything, and that's why he's so relaxed. He asks the mechanic to give him a prophylactic beating, at which point he thanked the protagonist's friend, saying that he would do just that. At that moment, his friend tries to say something to the protagonist about today's race, but he fell asleep right in the car and did not even have time to listen to what he wanted to say. After a while, Leo woke up in bed. He looked a little angry and didn't realize where he was now. Suddenly, he saw the mechanic at his feet who was taking off his shoes. At this point, the protagonist wondered where they were now and why they were not in a hotel. He also realized that he could actually drink a little more back then. He also suddenly wondered why the mechanic was not present at the party, because he thought that he did not see his friend. But then Jay says that he usually misses such events, to which the protagonist said that he had forgotten about it. According to him, Jay lives a very boring life because he doesn't have fun at all, and that's why he always has a gloomy face. At that moment, Leo noticed his friend's sad face and said that if something happened today, he could play with Jay's joystick to cheer him up. But Jay immediately refuses, saying that it's too late for such games. He argues his refusal that tomorrow he still has to go to New York before lunch in order to pack his things. Of course, Leo did not even understand what his friend said, although he had already warned him about it earlier. Then Jay is about to leave and only emphasizes that in order for them to discuss this topic in more detail, the protagonist must first get some sleep and sober up. But Leo is very impatient and says that he doesn't want to wait, and so he asks Jay to lay out right now what he's going to do. It turns out that the protagonist is already very much annoyed by his friend's habit of keeping silent and tolerating when he clearly has something to say. So shaking Jay's hand, he once again asks what kind of things he needs to take away from New York. But at that moment, the mechanic did not even look at his favorite, but only said that he too was fed up with everything that was going on. Of course, the champion did not even understand everything, and so he asked if he understood correctly that his friend had just stated directly that he was fucking him up. He was unhappy with these words and immediately wondered who could say such a thing to his boyfriend. When Jay leaves, Leo asks what will happen next. He doesn't wonder if Jay thinks he should say thank you for putting up with him, but since he didn't hear an answer to his question, Leo asked him to explain it normally and doesn't understand why he has to pull information out of his boyfriend. Leo got even more angry and threw a pillow at him, saying that if he made another move, it was over between them and he would tear up his mechanic. Hearing these words, Jay finally turns to his friend and asks him to come to his senses, because the only person who has been abandoned is Leo Lombardi himself. After hearing this, the champion could not utter another word and only watched with a surprised face as his faithful mechanic left him for good. The next day, the protagonist finally woke up. He immediately grabbed his head. I felt severe pain. Naturally, because of this, he immediately wondered how much alcohol he had drunk yesterday. Also, do not remember that his lover left him. He said he needed coffee, but when he touched the empty bed, Leo immediately tried to figure out what was going on. Of course, he got up from the bed to look around the room he was in, but after looking in all the rooms, he noticed that Jay wasn't here. Leo wondered where his friend had gone, even though he hadn't said anything to him, because he remembered that Jay had been in this place with him yesterday. But suddenly, the main character's memory of Jay asking him to finally come to his senses, because he was being dumped at that moment, came back to him. Heroes decides to brew his own coffee and trying to call his friend realizes that he has not yet contacted, although usually around this time should call him already. It turns out he doesn't even understand the reason for their yesterday's fight, because his friend yesterday said something about the things that need to be packed. And when Leo asked him for some reason, he even refused to explain the situation to him normally. He assumes that in this situation he should probably be more angry than Jay. He even got a little angry and looked at his phone and immediately threw it on the bed, deciding that he didn't care and wasn't going to sit and wait for his friend here. He also tries to remember how long they've been together, and it turns out that the duration of their friendship was 5 years, which surprises him a bit. He catches you at one point thinking that maybe their separation will be good for him. Considering how busy he's been lately, he realizes that even if he stays single for a while, he won't die from it. And if he needs to have fun, he decides that he can find someone to be with. Then he decides that even without his friend, he will not be lost. Then 10 days pass, and the protagonist talking to his sister on the phone tells her that he has a problem. According to him, he lost his bag, as well as his wallet and keys, which were also in it. Of course, his sister was a little surprised by his brother's absent-mindedness, but hastened to point out that he had lost his cell phone a few days ago. Hearing this, the protagonist tells Harper that lately he has something very strange going on with him, because he loses some things. He has some confusion with the schedule. The guy even has a feeling that a black cat has crossed his path and thus brings him bad luck. Harper, who is his younger sister, says that all this is happening because her brother is just an ordinary jerk when it comes to racing. She also says that if their older sister finds out about this incident, the guy will be in trouble. But at that moment, the middle one of Leo's three sisters, Emily, joins their conversation and asks how Jay is feeling. She says that, given their brother's difficult character, Jay probably can't stand to watch his negligence anymore. So she wondered if he had said anything to the protagonist about it. But then Leo immediately changed his face and realized that the subject had come up. He tells his sisters that 10 days ago he and his friend broke up, surprising the girls very much. They realize that Jay left Leo alone, but then Leo enters their conversation and says that he left his friend, not the other way around. At this point, the girls began to mock their brother, laughing that the initiator of all this is he himself, according to them. Even considering the fact that Leo is their younger brother, this act is worthy of the title of trash. They even felt sorry for Jay, and they decide that they need to meet with him sometime and treat the poor guy to dinner. Then Leo laughed a little at those words and said that he felt as if everyone thought his friend was some kind of innocent lamb. He even asked if he had never told them about minus Jay. Turns out he wants to talk about what Jay, who everyone thinks is a saint, did the day they first met. Even talks about catching his friend literally slinging mud behind his back. But the sisters interrupt their little brother and, showing him their new nails, asks, "Do they really look very cute?" It turns out they didn't even listen to their little brother and only talk about Jay. The girls believe that if they plead with him a little, he will take their little brother back. Well then, a little angry Leo says that they don't have to do anything and asks them to forget about this situation. But he decided to end the conversation and tells the sisters that he is going to train. In his opinion, the fact that his sisters immediately thought that it was their younger brother who had made some mistake out of their pair was quite surprising. It turned out that it is not only his sisters and all others. He realizes that everyone around him remains on the side of the mechanic, and even members of his team. According to the main character, Jay has tried very hard to create such a perfect image in the eyes of others. However, despite everything, it turns out the left keeps crossing paths with his mechanic wherever he goes, and this fact annoys him terribly much. At one point, he can't even stand it and asks Jay to go to another gym, arguing that there are plenty of free ones. But then Jay says that he came here first. But for the main character, these words, they are an argument because he thinks he is right in this situation and says that he trains here every day so that Jay will have to leave anyway. But then Jay says that just like his ex-friend, he has also always occupied this very place. And so if he doesn't like something, then let him go. At which point Leo is completely unhappy with his ex-friend's behavior and thinks he's being insolent. Turns out he doesn't realize that it's not really that simple. After 5 years together, their daily habits have become literally the same. He even remembers some of the times they spent time together, and it gave him goosebumps. Either way, whether he wants to or not, he realizes that every day he's going to run into his mechanic and even begins to wonder if they're really fighting with him or if it's just his imagination. Then Leo decides that as a man of big heart, he will forgive his friend for today, so he won't charge him for being here anymore. At that moment, Jay increases his speed on his machine, which is naturally noticed by the protagonist, who is surprised to see it, after which he also increased his speed. It turns out that the narcissistic Leo thought that Jay's speeding up was a challenge to him, and he thinks it's very childish, but he keeps speeding up just like Jay. At one point, he notices that his mechanic again increased speed, and then the left one thought that he was completely crazy. But at the same time, he was not going to retreat and decided to see who was more enduring. After 30 minutes of such intense running, both guys were incredibly tired. But the main character's ego was still comforted by the fact that he thought he was faster than his friend. He began to praise himself again, thinking it was a waste to try to compete with him, because he would never be able to defeat him. But at that moment, Jay suddenly takes off his shirt because he's sweating a lot from the intense running. At this moment, Leo observes this beautiful picture and thinks that however the body of his former friend certainly looks amazing. It turns out that despite all the training that, and spend the main characters, he still does not get it to grow so much muscle mass. He even believes that it is a little unfair. It is at this moment that he realizes what he has lost, because he remembers his friend's very firm and round thighs. He feels sorry that he can't see them right now. At this point, the main character even began to drool as he suddenly realized that he was thinking about the wrong thing. and grabbed his head and did not understand why in his head are such thoughts. He suggests that it may be because he has not had fun for a long time, but still it presses on him. Suddenly, he also begins to undress, which very much surprises Jay. It turns out the protagonist decided that perhaps this is too high temperature, his brains are not working properly, and therefore they need to refresh. At this point, Jay tries to talk to Leo, but suddenly another young man touches Jay's arm and tells him that it's been a long time since they've seen each other. Looking sweetly at the mechanic, the guy apologizes and says he'll distract him for a while and wonders if they can talk to Jay alone. The mechanic did not refuse this opportunity, and we learn that this young man is the second racer of the Akron team. At this point, the protagonist pays attention to the young man and tries to remember his name. It turns out that this guy recently shows good results in races and also often appears on the podium of the winners with the protagonist. But suddenly, the protagonist again pushes his ego and emphasizes that this guy appears on the podium is still not as often as him. But at this point in time, he is concerned about the young man's completely unsportsmanlike accomplishments, and he only wonders what these two have in common and why they went away to talk. But suddenly, he dismisses all thoughts from his head, thinking that Jay has no one but him, not even friends. Turns out he is even convinced that they got together, only because the protagonist generously agreed to have fun with the jam. But it still bothers him that they have been talking alone for a long time, and he even wondered why Jay stopped training. He thinks that he is not going to continue, and suddenly starts to get jealous of his former friend to the young racer. He watches the guys talking to each other for a long time and realizes that if he was even a little closer, he could hear what they were saying. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed how his former friend smiled at his new comrade, and it made him so much surprised that he could not take his eyes off it. Naturally, the fact that during the training the main character was distracted by strangers made him lose his balance, and he flew off the track onto the floor at that moment. Jay couldn't let this go and immediately went to his former friend and asked him for permission to examine his injured leg. Leo, who couldn't turn down the opportunity, immediately gave permission, and Jay examined his leg and told him it was slightly swollen. It turns out that Jay expected something like this to happen to the protagonist when he looked at him and realized that he was obviously thinking about something else. According to him, the season is in full swing, and so the protagonist should finally pull himself together. But that's not what Leo is thinking about. It turns out that he only thinks that his former friend never misses an opportunity to lecture him, and even mentally accuses him of walking around naked. After a short exchange of remarks, the protagonist realizes that now he can hardly get behind the wheel, and so he has to give the keys to his car to his former friend. At that moment, another guy approaches the protagonist, and Jay asks him to give him first aid because he has twisted his ankle a little. Immediately afterwards, he goes to his new comrade, and the latter asks how the racing champion feels and if he is all right, at which point Jay, who has no feelings, says that his friend must have gotten only a small sprain. At this moment, Leo is surprised to see the behavior of his former friend, and the guy who came up to him apologized and said that right now, he will give first aid to the protagonist. After some time, Frank was already behind the wheel of the car in which the protagonist was. Leo immediately asked if his manager thought that in 4 days his leg would be healed. But then the already calm manager reports that when he first heard that his champion had injured his leg, he almost had a heart attack. He even reports that he is glad that it was a sprain. After these words, he begs the protagonist to behave more carefully and even asks if the protagonist is going to win this year's championship, to which he immediately received a positive answer. But then Leo emphasizes that he wants to ask a very interesting question. Also, he emphasizes that he is not asking this question because something happened but more out of interest. Suddenly, he doesn't ask Frank if Jay really knew the second Akron racer, at which point Frank says that Leo could at least remember the guy's name, because in a way he is still his competitor. It turns out that Jay's new comrade is Peter Erickson. Frank then deigned to answer his ward's question and said he knew nothing about it, but wondered if Jay might have some reason to meet with riders from other teams. But suddenly, remembering some information, Frank says that if it is about the Akron team, Jay could have met this driver when their mechanic was offered a place in the team. Of course, hearing this, Leo looked at his manager sharply and was surprised. He was very excited about what he had found out and wondered, does this mean that Akron was trying to poach Jay to his team? He resented the fact that Akron thought they could do it. But then, a calm Frank wondered with surprise if his ward really didn't know about it. He immediately informs that at the end of the last season, the mechanic received an offer to move to them, and Jay even agreed to consider the offer, after which they also negotiated. According to Frank, the conditions were probably very good because, after all, Jay is a skilled mechanic who stands out from the crowd. And among other things, he has a great desire to learn and develop in his business. According to Frank, Sure is a good and successful team, but Jay could have gained a lot of valuable experience working for Akron. And it turns out that the Enk even expected Jade to give the go-ahead. But in the end, he still refused. At which point, a surprised Lombardi says that this is the first time he's heard about it, because no one told him about it. He was very surprised by this, and said that it was impossible, because Jay is a terribly obliging and honest guy who would hardly hide such a thing. He emphasizes that Jay must have told Leo about it, but it just slipped his mind. At a certain point in their conversation, Left realizes that the moment his friend told him to pack, he was telling him exactly that. All the information that he learned made the protagonist not on a joke frightened, because he realized that all this means whether the same planned to pack his bags to escape to the Akron. He even suggests that this is why they broke up. But then, Frank calms the protagonist and emphasizes that the contract with the team is impossible to break in the middle of the season, and also says that the guy did not know about it. According to him, no matter how much Leo's head was not filled with one race, to think so tight is too much even for him. Then Leo states that he was not talking about the present tense at all. He suggests that maybe his friend is preparing to leave in advance, because he realizes that he may have bored him so much that he wants to stay away by all means. These words made Frank hesitate, but after a short thought, he said that he had heard that Leo himself had done things that made him worthy of such behavior on Jay's part. The reaction of the main character to these words naturally did not take long to wait, and he began to act like a cat with a demon in it. At which point, Frank realized that perhaps he should not have been so straightforward with his racer. But then Frank began to calm the protagonist and said that he was worried for nothing, because Jay is not that kind of person. He states that he came right after him to the team, and therefore assumes that most likely the guy will not give up everything after 5 years of hard work for which they together raised the team to the current indicators. Also, Frank declares that for today he canceled all plans for the schedule of his subordinate, and therefore he can go home and properly rest from all this. Then Leo thinks only that he also joined the team only because of Jay, but he decides that he did this act only because then also did not understand anything about racing. It turns out that 5 years ago, Jay was in a bar with his buddies, one of them grabbing his head and saying that before he had only heard what L1 was, but now he realized that it was much more complicated than he thought. He realizes that in all likelihood it will take years or two before they succeed, at which point the other guy says that their team is only 2 years old and they have a long way to go. In his opinion right now, the main problem of their team is money. He also emphasizes that they are still very lucky because their cars are still in service with the available budget. He also talks about how there seems to be one vacant seat next year, and so he was wondering if there was any driver in mind who had a bunch of sponsors to bring investment into the team. Then the second young man said that if they wanted a famous racer who fits that description best, is the protagonist of the Left Lombardi. The guy is surprised by the fact that Leo, in addition to everything else and starred in advertising, it turns out he does not understand how he could achieve such incredible success, because he debuted only this year, and he already has a lot of sponsors. At this point, his friend tells him that all because the guy, as soon as he debuted, began to show excellent results, and therefore advertisers take advantage of the fact that the fee for his filming is still the cheapest. They cannot even believe that he naturally managed to achieve such success, because first he was a model and now became a good racer. The guy's comrade states that he was jealous of such a thing because the protagonist and handsome and one of the 7 Lombardi, which is quite famous and now also racer L1, he dreams of achieving at least something from this list. But the blonde calmly states that everyone lives with the fate with which he was lucky enough to be born. At this point, they notice Jay and ask his opinion about it. It turns out the guy realizes that eventually they will work together with the mechanic. So next season, but they still know nothing about each other. Naturally, Jay answers the young man's question and puts his mug of beer on the table and declares that anyone is good enough for their team, as long as that person is not Leo. According to him, there is no one worse than him. At this point, the guys realized why the chief was telling them they didn't have to have a DJ at their event. Naturally, after hearing such words, Jay's comrades said that they had better change the subject because it's the end of the season, and a lot of unnecessary people can hear their conversation. At that moment, the guy who was next to him on the chair touches Jay with his back. It turns out that this young man was the main character who asked why they should change the subject, because according to him personally, he was interested to hear the continuation of their conversation. The guys who were with the mechanic at the table were very surprised to see Leo Lombardi in front of them. Well then, the protagonist immediately emphasized that he did not intend to eavesdrop, but in the end, it was about him, so he has the right to intervene and could not stay away. He immediately asks the mechanic why he thinks that he is the worst racer, arguing that he was really curious about the reason for his attitude towards him. Then J.I.'s teammates tried to justify him in the eyes of the rider and said that their friend meant absolutely not. He even started to make his teammates apologize to the rider. But then, Leo calmed down the young man and stated that they have no problems, and stated that he even likes to hear honest feedback about himself. He even asks Jay to answer him as it really is, because he promises not to be angry about the answer. After hearing these words, Jay thought a little and turned to the guy. He said that, first of all, he does not like him because of his too aggressive driving style, which provokes a huge number of unnecessary accidents. Of course, the protagonist also agrees with this statement, even stating that he is regularly pointed out to him by his coach. But Jay did not stop criticizing him and said that another important disadvantage of the guy is that he easily falls for the provocations of opponents. Jay even sometimes has the feeling that pride for the guy is more important than the team and quality rolling, and in his opinion for the pro is not worse problem to find. These words are already beginning to increase the stress level of the protagonist, who says that it can really look that way from the outside. But right after that, the mechanic began to criticize him even harder and more diligently, which made the protagonist angry. Raising his anger scale to the limit, he did not understand why he suddenly received so much criticism. But in the end, Jay summarizes his conversation by saying that he thinks the protagonist is overrated, and without his team, he is nothing. In order to somehow justify himself, Leo visits Tone and says that he is surprised by the mechanic's expertise. He suddenly starts to tease Jay and asks how old he is, because he looks very young. Leo even assumes that he is an ordinary high school student. But then Jay said that next year would be his 1-year anniversary of L1 racing. But he was not impressed and just laughed at those words. It turns out that he did not even believe you that the mechanic has been working for only a year, because he thought that he was an experienced master, especially given the lecture that he just gave to the racer. At this point, realizing that the mechanic himself is also inexperienced, he began to accuse him of the usual chatter. But Jay easily repelled these claims to himself and said that his experience in L1 has nothing to do with the topic of conversation. Immediately after that, the main character and his future friend began to quarrel and accuse each other of various things that were completely unrelated to the topic of their conversation. Naturally then, seeing what is going on, those two comrades began to think that they have found a common language because they are both just children. At this time, the blonde says that seeing the mechanic so he at least begins to resemble his age, because he usually always walks with a stern expression on his face. At a certain point, their conversation reached its limit, and Leo grabbed Jay by his shirt and said that if you're caught gossiping behind your back, the first thing you should do is apologize. But Jay once again parried such a claim and said that Leo asked him to say what he didn't like, at which point they were interrupted by a huge man who crunched his fingers in their faces. He immediately grabbed both guys and escorted them out of the establishment, saying that no fighting was allowed here. He looked really, really big against them. When the two guys were outside, Leo said that Jay had a very friendly team because she let him go out alone, while Jay was talking to his friend, who advised him to make up with the racer after they had sobered up. Suddenly, the racer notices Jay starting to leave and immediately asks where he is going, but the mechanic only replied that he is going to his room. Of course, this surprised Leo, who immediately asked if it was true that he was not going to drink anymore. It was at this point that the protagonist learned that his favorite mechanic is not a drinker at all, and today, just for the first time, gathered to sit with the team. It was after these words the racer realized that the mechanic is quite strange, and even assumed that he has no friends. After that, they both headed in the same direction. because as it turned out, the racer is in the same hotel as the mechanic. As they both walked in the same direction, Leo suddenly asked who was the best rider if he was that bad. According to him, he really interested in the answer to that question. But then Jay said that he would apologize to the guy, but he would only do so if he stopped following him. Of course, Lombardi immediately refused, saying that he did not want an apology, but only an answer to the question. Naturally, the mechanic agreed to give an answer to this question, as suddenly he simultaneously with the racer called the name of the same legend, whose name is Rafael Silva. They were both surprised that their answers coincided, as Lombardi couldn't expect anyone to name this racer in the first place. He expected the mechanic to rather name the two more popular riders, but Jay only stated that these people couldn't even compare to Rafael. Then did I tell him that he reads as well as the mechanic. And it was at this point that they started to get closer. Immediately afterwards, walking in the embrace, the guys began to discuss Rafael's racing history in awe. They both admired his technique and skills on the track. After a while, Lombardi hugs Jay and says that although he is a bit of a wrong person, he is generally a good person, and they have a lot in common. At this point, Jay's only thought is that his mood is racing at the speed of light. But Leo didn't stop talking and said that judging by all the factors, he likes the same drivers and teams, and he really knows about it. He only still doesn't understand the fact that Jay doesn't like him so much. At this point, the mechanic, who is in a perplexed state, wonders if he is really drunk, because otherwise he can't explain why he keeps wasting his time on this guy. But suddenly, the racer grabbed Leo and their heads were incredibly close to each other. Naturally, Leo began to pry from Jay what was wrong and asked him to tell him why he thought he was such a terrible racer. But it turns out that Jay just doesn't like the fact that Lombardi treats the case after a sleeve. He has long noticed that the racer is pissed at the throat of what he is doing at the moment. From these revelations, Leo blushed all over, and after a little bit of thinking, asked the mechanic how he guessed that it was like that. At that moment, the guy's eyes finally lit up. But suddenly, he got a phone call from someone that pissed off the young racer a bit. It turns out that person is his manager, Frank. After a short conversation and a lecture, the driver said they were near Lower and Aston Streets. Frank was immediately glad he was not alone and asked the other man to shove the drivers into a cab and send him to the Pilton Hotel. Naturally, Jay immediately said he'd do it right away, and suddenly realized that the guy's hotel wasn't in the same direction as his, but on the opposite side of town. After a while, he had already put the riders in a cab and asked to be taken to the Pilton Hotel. Jay also told him to go to the hotel and kept talking to his manager, but realizing that the rider was just lost, he told him not to do that next time and either remember the way to his hotel or ask people how to get there. He said he should not waste time like that. Then Leo declared that he hadn't wasted a second of his time because he was having real fun with the mechanic, at which point he even blushed a little. Naturally, Leo continued to communicate with his manager, and as it turned out, the latter listened attentively to everything that was going on, assuming that there was something more than friendship between the guys. It turns out that the racer suddenly became interested in what team his new friend is a member of, and immediately asked his manager about it, who, after a little thought, said that of the teams that have only been racing for 2 years, there is only Zeus. Suddenly, after this answer, Lombardi states that he wants to move to this team because he heard that they have a vacancy. At this point, the manager was incredibly surprised. It turns out that just last week, the protagonist himself gave him a directive that they should immediately reject all offers from low-ranked teams. Naturally, he was interested in such changes and asked about it directly, but his words could not affect the decision of the protagonist. And after a short time, the news appeared that Leo Lombardi made a move that no one expected and moved to the team Zeus. Immediately after this action is transferred to the present time in New York in the month of June, it turns out at this point in time has already gone 51st day, when Leo Lombardi did not feel real happiness, and so he decided to buy himself a toy. But it naturally did not make him happy at all. Of course, Leo didn't really want this toy because he's terribly embarrassed about it. But since the qualifying races are coming up, he's worried about his condition, which leaves a lot to be desired. He doesn't even realize how he could have fallen so far down the results time after time, because once he was on the 1st place, he fell all the way down to the 6th place. He even suggests that it all looks very delusional because he fell from the 1st place to the 6th because of lack of affection. At one point in time, he even thought he could find a partner quickly, but his search was unsuccessful. Turns out he was looking on Tinder. then switched to bars for similar people. There, the waiter was only surprised that he was the same racer. But as it turned out, such attention only unnerved the protagonist. In the final attempt, he tried to take a closer look at his immediate surroundings and even began to pay attention to the members of his team. At one point, he thought of a shaved-headed man, but he was confused by his height. And looking at the second, he realized that he had heard bad things about him. At a certain point, the protagonist even began to think about his manager, but he was confused by his age. It turns out Leo didn't expect that finding a partner of interest would be such a difficult task. But suddenly he started putting cream on his hands, thinking that frankly his door is sad without any solid objects inside the opening. He thought he could use something to fill that void. It turns out he doesn't even really understand how to open the door, because his friend Jay was always in charge of that. And now they naturally don't talk to each other anymore. But suddenly, after he started to get something, he realized that he could not do anything about the fact that he imagines his former friend, because he would have to use him as a fantasy for this process. At a certain point, the protagonist is even sure that Jay also, in a similar context, remembered him, but suddenly remembering a picture of his ex-friend talking to another guy, he realized that maybe it's not true. Suddenly, the protagonist begins to convince himself that Jay can't spend time with his new friend as well as with him because he is not like him at all. In his opinion, it would be even strange. He believes that if his former friend really was going to leave so abruptly and change everything, he should at least get rid of the traces of the past, because the protagonist realizes that his friend did not need to go to New York. He made this conclusion after arriving in New York. He saw that all things are in their place as they were before, at the moment when his friend was not going to leave. Of course, he does not understand why everything is like this. He wonders why suddenly Jay did not put a stop to their relationship and decided to leave him so brazenly. At that moment, he looks at a picture of them together, remembering what used to be. At a certain point, the protagonist realized that he could not enjoy his time without his friend. But after some time in Silverstone came the Grand Prix final. Commentators are surprised by the fact that 17 laps remain, and the protagonist is already changing his tires for the second time. At this point, his team is fully prepared to change tires. Naturally, the change of tires did not take too long. And this fact again surprised commentators because, according to them, everything happened exactly as I expected. Because the precise work of the team of the protagonist at the pit stop admires as always. At the same time, another commentator emphasizes that he really hasn't noticed any flaws for the main character's team, unlike the guy himself, who is having a very hard time today in their opinion. The commentators also emphasize that his results and speed have been falling steadily lately, which is a very strange factor for them, because he doesn't make any big mistakes. It turns out that even turns in which the protagonist was given with great difficulty, according to them today, is quite good weather outside, and the conditions as if even created for the protagonist. But they still cannot understand what is the matter. After all, if the situation does not change, he is expected to be left behind. Of course, given the unstable condition of the protagonist in the end of the race, he drops out of the top 10, which cannot help but make him angry. At this time, the champion aloofly leaves without even paying attention to those who won. At this point, Jay grabs the guy's hand and turns to him, but he just pushes him away, even in a way disrespecting his old friend. After this race in social networks unexpectedly sprinkled comments of the main character, of course. People as usual divided into two camps. Some supported Leo, and others only criticized him, saying that everything should happen this way. After some time, the protagonist meets his sisters, and they say that they suddenly miss their little brother very much. They say that they don't understand why he wears sunglasses at night, and they also say that London hasn't changed at all during their absence. Hearing these words, the main character, who tried to seem brutal because of his glasses, immediately changed in his face, and as if even almost cried. It turned out that he is also quite a sentimental man who missed his sisters. At this point, video state of his brother, his sisters began to tease him, claiming that a very mature guy started crying because of this. They even jokingly say that the guy decided to beat them in advance because he is afraid to get caught up. But suddenly, they change the subject and ask the guy to recommend where to go and what to see in London. After some time, the mechanic was standing outside looking at his phone, smoking a cigarette. He looked very annoyed and not at all happy. It turned out that he was looking intently at his phone. although the screen was off as if he was waiting for something. But suddenly, someone called him from outside and distracted him from this activity. The team director immediately states that he thought Jay had quit smoking after joining their team, and also asks if Jay has thought about their last conversation. According to the director, to leave at such a difficult moment will be very difficult for the mechanic. But he also emphasizes that such an opportunity is rare, and therefore the guy should not miss his chance. Naturally, Jay immediately emphasizes that he is well aware of the director's words, but still asks him to give him a little more time to think. At the same time, the protagonist is in a restaurant with his sisters, who sweetly ask him if he feels better, but hearing the ambiguous answer of the guy, they said that by doing so, he even offends them a little bit. After all, they have come a long way to support him, but the main character immediately said that his sisters are just lying and asks that they do not lie because they came to London only for shopping. But his sisters completely deny this version of what is happening, and emphasize again that they came here only because they missed their younger brother, who is very busy and with whom they can only communicate by video link. One of them even states that she dreamt about him. Suddenly, they ask Leo if he will be in Italy in 2 months, because their mom and dad also miss their youngest son. At that moment, the guy says that everything will be just so, and he will specially fly a week before the arrival. It turns out that Leo is even a little stressed by the fact that the race will be held in his homeland, because he realizes that there will be a lot of fans, and if he does something wrong again, it will cause heated discussions in society. But his sister believes in the guy and says that he will be able to cope with everything. According to her, if to be completely frank, even the fact of participation of the guy in the race is worthy of praise, because before he quickly cooled down to everything. And now he is so much passionate. She even emphasizes that apparently the guy has good reasons for this. At a certain moment of their conversation, the girl even emphasizes that if the guy becomes too difficult to engage in this profession, he can leave it at any time, and asks him not to forget about it. But the protagonist, as if with coldness reacting to her words, says that this is the easiest way. But then he says that according to him, it's not about the difficulties at all. It's about the fact that he's trying, and in return, nothing works the way it used to. He says that he can't even explain why things happen the way they do. According to him, he has even noticed a tendency that in the last and most important moment of the race, he is constantly unlucky, and therefore he does not manage to show himself as he can really do it. Suddenly, one of his sisters claims that she has an idea why this is happening, and claims that the main reason for their brother's failure is his ex-boyfriend Jay. But the guy naturally pretends that he doesn't even know what his sisters are talking about. Well then, the guy's sister asks if he remembers what he used to call his friend. And as it turns out, Leo used to call Jay his fortune when he was dating Jay. These words even gave the protagonist goosebumps, and he immediately said that this is a complete abomination. But his sisters again said it, and said that his brother made a lot of noise as if it was the first time he fell in love. But then the protagonist argues his actions that at the beginning of a relationship, many people do all sorts of incomprehensible things, and according to him, he was the same. But the sisters are not going to give up and say that then his results really improved, and the frivolous younger brother turned into a conscientious boy, and even grew a little. But the protagonist again started to deny everything, while his sisters stated that if you cut their conversation short, then in general fortune left the guy. At this point, they hinted that Jay dumped him, and also that he took all their brother's luck with him. But the protagonist again denied everything, and even laughed, unlike his sisters, who could not understand how otherwise to explain that after Leo's breakup with his friend, his results deteriorated sharply, and he learned to drive. According to them, this is the main reason why Leo should make up with Jay. They also say that no one but that mechanic can stand their brother's character. And on top of that, they say that pride will not lead Leo to good things. Naturally, the guy was not very happy about it, and emphasized that he didn't even understand why Jay broke up with him. Of course, hearing this, his sister was very surprised and wondered if the guy still hadn't asked Jay about it. But the main character of the city said that he does not see the point of raking up the past, and moreover, they did not even communicate after they broke off the relationship. At this point, all the girls thought, as suddenly in the head, as if some plan appeared and they all looked at each other. It seemed as if the thoughts of all the girls in one mix fell, and they realized how they should act. Of course, Leo also noticed the looks of his sisters, and immediately pasted and at the table asked what was wrong with their looks, and asked them not to scare him with their actions, and also asked them not to even think of interfering in his relationship. After a while, it was night outside, and Jay, who was in his apartment, noticed that suddenly his phone rang. It turns out that what happened, and so much expected and so much feared, at this moment he received a call from the main character. He immediately very quickly grabbed his phone and began to look at the photo. But still, Jay decided to answer the phone, and it turned out that one of the sisters of the main character called Harper. She told the guy that her phone was dead, and that's why she was calling from Leo's phone. The girl immediately informs that at this moment in time they are in a bar, and their brother got very drunk, and so started reminiscing endlessly about his former friend. They are not interested. Can Jay take him right now from this place? Naturally, Jay tried to refuse the offer, but after some thought, he said that of course he would come to the bar right away and pick up his friend. After a short time, the mechanic was already in the bar. Of course, the girls did not know about it, and called him again to ask if he was here, to which they received a positive answer. But it turns out that their brother also disappeared somewhere. They do not understand where he could have gone, but assume that he probably went to the toilet. At that moment, Jay sees the protagonist himself in the arms of some guy walking around the bar and coming out of the restroom. It turns out that the guy asked the protagonist if he really wanted to get intimate with him first, and now he wants to leave. According to the guy, the protagonist is playing hard to get, but unexpectedly, Leo himself notices his former friend and is very much surprised by his visit to this place. At this time, his new friend asks the protagonist if they will go together for security equipment. At this point, the mechanic looked quite calm, while the main character's sisters he was chatting with were quite excited. At this point, the mechanic stated that he was finally able to find their brother. At that moment, the sisters of the protagonist came to them, who were surprised that that guy was doing next to their brother. At that moment, the protagonist himself was wondering why his old friend was here. But in order to somehow establish a relationship with him, he even threw his new friend's hand off his shoulder. Naturally, the new friend of the protagonist did not want to let him go, and immediately grabbed him and said that they had an agreement that they would continue to know each other after they could provide themselves with sufficient protection. But the protagonist was not going to continue communication with this guy because he saw his lover, and in order to get away from his new acquaintance, he even hit him hard with his fist. After a while, Leo was able to catch up with Jay on the street and asked him to stop so they could talk about what was going on between them. Naturally, Leo tries to justify himself and say that his friend probably misunderstood what happened between him and that guy. But then Leo turns on his stubbornness again and asks why he should justify himself to his former friend at all. He says he doesn't have to do that because they've already broken up, and Jay has nothing to be angry about. At which point, Jay is even surprised that Leo thinks he's angry. But suddenly Jay says that if things like that made him angry, they probably wouldn't have been able to be together for 5 years. Leo was a little surprised, and suddenly, he even got angry, saying that he did not give any reason for his partner to be angry during their relationship. He even says that Jay is trying to build a picture of a hurt person, but he will not succeed. After all, he should have expressed his grievances earlier. Naturally, the mechanic found a way to parry this argument and asked if it was so would listen to him then, to which the young racer said that it is indeed so. After all, he has ears for it. Then Jay condescendingly asked his former partner to finally grow up, because he is not 19 years old anymore, but whether his usual behavior is very stubborn, and asks if the mechanic is really making him extreme again. He wonders if Jay really thinks he has nothing to show for it, and suddenly claims that Jay has been hiding negotiations with the other team from his lover. But the mechanic does not succumb to such provocations, and only confidently states that his negotiations with the other team is completely unrelated to their relationship, which surprised the left. At that moment, the driver tried to realize these words, and thought that Jay had been planning to break up with him since that time, and was serious about sneaking to another team. Because of these thoughts, he got angry, and suddenly took off his cap from his head, saying that he could not understand what was going on in his head, trying to somehow pressure his former friend, even ordered him to look him in the eyes, and asked him what was the problem to tell him about his plans. It also turns out that Leo doesn't understand why he decided to do it in the middle of the season, and even at one point assumes that Jay wants to do it so that Leo will fail the season, because he must have been paid by someone. But at this point, Jay is not going to answer that question, and only wonders if Leo considered him his boyfriend during their relationship. Such a question left the protagonist with an open mouth. At this point, Jay grabs his head and says that all this is already making him dizzy, because as soon as left again in the woods in some kind of trouble, everyone immediately called him. It turns out over time it began to depress the mechanic. He suddenly declares that there was no relationship between them, because he can't remember a single moment when they did something that real couples do. He says that Leo could get intimacy with anyone, because there are so many people around. According to the mechanic, he even assumed at first that it was because they were too close. After all, they spent every second together, and it seemed that if a little from each other, everything could be better. It turns out that he even hoped to be able to save their relationship, but it didn't work out, and so he suggests that the protagonist end it all before it gets worse. The mechanic also says that he will move all his things to New York with Frank's help, and so asks Leo to make sure he doesn't get any more calls about his problems. Immediately after these words, the mechanic immediately left, leaving Leo alone with his thoughts. Sometime later, when Jay was in his car, he got very angry about what was happening and punched the steering wheel of his car. Apparently, he was very upset about the breakup. At this point, he even began to remember how the relationship between him and the racer had developed. It turns out that one day, Leo very happily approached his friend. He immediately asked his mechanic if he had heard that Leo had managed to set a new record for a practice lap. Then Jay coldly told him that it was great news, but Leo was very much surprised by this cold attitude towards himself. He suddenly states that he's gotten a lot more serious like Jamie advised, and so he asks for the guy to praise him in a normal way, but instead Jay just states that Leo has room to grow. Of course, he immediately said that Jay was being mean, but then he wondered where exactly he was going to grow up. At which point, the rest of the team was watching them and wondering if the guys had gotten tired of arguing yet. After all, the whole team has already noticed that the outcome of their arguments is always predetermined, and the winner in these disputes, as usual, is always Jay. At that moment, another team member told the driver that they had to do the last lap, and then he could start to rest. At that moment, proud of his victories, Leo asked the mechanic to keep his eyes open, because now he would go 1,000 times cooler. At this point, Jay was approached by Frank, who stated that he had never seen Leo so diligent before, and even stated that he seemed to really want to please the mechanic. But Jay said he wasn't sure about that at all, at which time Frank looked at him in surprise and thought about how young people were different in their day. But suddenly he asks Jay to step aside for a moment so they can talk. He immediately informs him that something important is going to happen tonight, and asks if Jay knows about it. He also emphasizes that it would be good if everyone was present, because he must realize that without him, Leo will do something again. But Jay says he's busy and won't be able to attend the event. After a while, we see the guy repairing his car. At that moment, some man comes up to him and tells the mechanic that his phone is about to burst. Naturally, he immediately looked who wrote to him and saw that it was Leo. At which point, the man said that if Jay had some urgent business, he could leave early, but the mechanic said that it was no big deal. After a little more time, Leo, who is in the villa, reported that his friend again does not answer. And does that mean that he will not come? Naturally, the girls who were there were surprised by this and asked if the left one was talking to any girl. But he immediately said that it was a mechanic from their team, who is also his main hater. Naturally, the girls at first did not understand why he called this guy, but Leo said that he was very funny and emphasizes that even though Jay is the same age as the main character, he still grumbles like an old man if Leo does not work out or eats well. At this point, the girls said that in this case, and everything is pretty much unambiguous, and they assume that Leo liked the mechanic. But the racer immediately states that this is excluded because the mechanic can only brainwash him and will never support a conversation not related to work. At this time, another friend of his intervenes in the conversation and says that it's bad enough because according to him, Jay does not want to be friends with the racer, but still follows his every move. According to this guy, Jane may be a stalker. At that moment, Leo, having a little thought, asks his friend not to smoke because he can't stand the smell of cigarettes, and he naturally puts out his cigarette. But at this point in time, Leo was already wondering if his new friend was really a stalker because he couldn't even think of such a thing. But he still realizes that if you think about it, they clash quite often in their views. After a while, Leo was very happy and surprised that his new friend had come to the party, He immediately asked when he had time to come. Naturally, Leo immediately leaves his friends and says he's going to go say hello to his mechanic and will be right back. After a short time, he approached Jay and told him that he had come just in time and he had been looking for an excuse to leave his friends. Naturally, such words very much surprised the mechanic, who immediately asked if these people are not his friends. But Leo parries these words and says that these people are just his acquaintances, and he was dying of boredom with them. Leo also winked at his mechanic and said that spending time with him was much more interesting for him than with his acquaintances. From these words, the young racer even blushed a little. Jay thought about it for a moment and was a little embarrassed. But then he said that he couldn't stay for too long because he had a job to do and he wouldn't drink alcohol because he was driving. At this point, Leo has already taken his mechanic by the hand and asked everyone present to pay a little attention to them. According to him, Jay, who is his colleague, has every second counted, but he's still found time to come to them. So he thinks that the mechanic is a really cool guy, and Leo also says that he adores him. After a while, Leo tells everyone present to raise their glasses to the best mechanic. At this point, he is still holding Jay's hand very tightly and asks him why he stopped like that. Of course, the mechanic at this point in time is already well aware of the fact that he will not be able to leave this place and that his escape plan has failed. After a while, he was already left alone, at which time the mechanic wondered how it had happened since he was really going to say hello and leave the party right away. But since his plan didn't work out, it started with dancing and then meeting Leo's friends, followed by a photo shoot, which he thinks is a complete cycle of torture for the introvert that he is. It turns out the guy doesn't even understand why he even came to this place, because he didn't even plan to do it. But Leo intervenes and distracts him from these thoughts. Dear friends, and if you want to see the continuation of this fascinating story, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and do not forget to click on the bell to not miss new videos. And work on the second part I will start when this video will collect 40,000 views or 5,000 likes.